Support for this podcast comes from the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative, connecting communities with the resources, infrastructure, and networks to ensure a vibrant local free press.
From KVPR in Fresno, this is Central Valley Daily. It's Friday, September 27th. I'm Elizabeth Arkalian. At one point around the early 1900s, the city of Hanford had a Chinese immigrant population of around 1,000.
The Chinese story in Hanford is really no different than any other immigrant story.
Hear more about Hanford's storied Chinese history and efforts to restore some of its historic buildings. That's coming up in just a few minutes, but first, today's headlines. The Fresno County Department of Public Health is investigating a potential exposure to tuberculosis at Fresno State and Fresno City College. TB is a bacterial infection that usually affects the lungs, but it can affect other areas of the body like the brain or spine. Students and staff who may have been exposed have been notified and have been asked to complete a survey or test for tuberculosis. Cases of the infection in California have increased by 24% over the last 3 years. A small Bakersfield school district is celebrating access to clean water thanks to a state project. KVPR's Rachel Livenall reports the district has been cited in the past for contaminated water.
The Rio Bravo Greeley Union School District has struggled with clean water for years, but state grants have helped it secure a new water treatment plant. The district was cited twice in the past because the water system contained nitrates and chemicals like 1,2,3-TCP. The district serves roughly 1,200 students and staff and serves an elementary school, middle school, district office, and employee housing. But despite the state's help, it doesn't mean the tiny district's problems are over. Officials say it will still require financial assistance to operate and manage the water treatment facility. For KVPR News, I'm Rachel Livenall.
The final evacuation order around the coffee pot fire in Tulare County was this week. That fire was started by lightning at the beginning of August, but is now 93% contained. The coffee pot fire burned more than 14,000 acres in areas near Sequoia National Park and Cabin Cove, and briefly sent smoke into the valley. Merced County's largest school district has seen some sudden changes in its leadership since the start of the school year. Brianna Vicari from our partner newsroom, the Merced Focus, reports about the latest shakeup at Merced City School District.
The Merced Focus has learned Associate Superintendent Brian Meisenheimer has been on paid administrative leave since the start of the school year. Meisenheimer served as the acting superintendent for about a year before Juliana Stocking was hired for the role. A divided school board united over the summer to hire her after a year-long search. The Merced Focus sought confirmation about Meisenheimer's employment on August 19th, but district officials initially declined to disclose it. Separately, a Merced City Schools board member announced he's also stepping down. Jesse Espinoza attended his final meeting on Tuesday. Months ago, he said he would not seek a second term. That leaves a vacancy on the 5-member board for a few months until someone new is elected. I'm Brianna Vicari.
A federal judge has approved a receiver to oversee a multi-million-dollar ag operation owned by the local Assemi brothers. The receiver will manage more than 50,000 acres of pistachios and almonds. The Assemis are known as one of the largest pistachio growers in the valley, but have reportedly fallen into debt and financial hardship in their ag business. The receiver will also get $32 million in funding from Prudential Insurance to cover the cost of harvesting the Assemis' crops.
Vice presidential candidates Tim Walz and J.D. Vance are set to face off in their very first debate on Tuesday, October 1st. KVPR will broadcast the debate live on the radio at kvpr.org and on the KVPR app. If you're in Fresno, you can also join us in person for a watch party at Me and Ed's on Tap in the Tower District. The debate starts at 6, but arrive at 5 to get a seat and play some politics-themed trivia. Learn more at kvpr.org/events.
And now to our main story. In the 1800s and into the 20th century, Hanford had a booming Chinese population, with some estimating that it ranged anywhere between 800 to 1,200 Chinese immigrants at its peak. Since then, the Chinese population has dwindled, but the community's rich cultural history remains. In Hanford, they have their own Chinatown, which they call China Alley. The alley once boasted many restaurants, herb stores, and a Taoist temple. Many of the structures are still present today. Arianna Wing is the president of the China Alley Preservation Society. Wing joined me for a conversation about China Alley's history and also to discuss their upcoming Moon Festival tribute.
The Chinese story in Hanford is really no different than any other immigrant story. They came to find a better way of life, hoping that they would have money to send home or they could return home as a wealthier person. They came with the gold rush. Here in this area, they came because of the railroads. And when the railroads were finished, they stayed in the area, and some of them were farm laborers, and they built their own city within the city of Hanford. Actually, there was a Chinatown before the city of Hanford was incorporated. There were Chinese in the area in the 1860s, whereas Hanford was incorporated in 1891.
And your family had a very famous restaurant in China Alley. Can you tell us about Imperial Dynasty?
To go back to the history of that, it's kind of a long tale. My great-grandfather was a political rabble-rouser in China, and he was very anti-government, and he was outspoken, and he was at a political rally outside of Guangzhou, and the government knew who he was, and they watched him, and they were started to chase him. So he ran and ran and ran and ran, and as the story goes, he ran until he came into the Pearl River, where he could run no more. And so he jumped, and he was rescued by a boat, and he found his fellow passengers were on their way to California to work on the railroads or wherever they could find work. And he opened up his noodle house in China Alley in 1883. And we were very fortunate to have an over 50-year run with that restaurant. And people came from all over. I feel very fortunate to have been a part of that.
There's also a Taoist temple museum in China Alley that was damaged by a fire in recent years, right? Can you tell us what happened?
I like to call the damage that was done to our historic Taoist temple museum, I call it arson fire, because I want people to know someone purposely set our museum on fire in 2021. And at this point, our building is structurally stable. Many of our artifacts were heavily damaged. Some of them are just, we're talking artifacts from the 1880s. They are just gone. But my world now revolves around insurance companies and conservators. Many of our artifacts were also able to be restored. And initially, I didn't think they could be, but there is this wonderful world of conservation. And it's amazing what they can do to smoke damaged artifacts, and it's just amazing.
This year, a tribute to the Moon Festival will return to Hanford. This actual festival hasn't happened since 2019. Just tell us about the Moon Festival, its history, and sort of the significance within the community.
The Moon Festival is one of the important Chinese holidays. It's kind of celebrating the end of the harvest season and just being thankful and spending time with your friends and family. It's held at the end of the harvest, and the celebration is that full moon. And a lot of round foods, such as mooncakes, are eaten during that time. And for about 40 years, the China Alley Preservation Society presented a moon festival to the public. It started off as sort of a thank you for the public support for our museum, and also a way of presenting a little bit of the Chinese culture to the public. And that event just grew and grew and grew. And after the arson and COVID, we couldn't prevent the Moon Festival because the Temple Museum was sort of the highlight of showing off our China Alley.
So I guess the natural next question is what is the future of the Moon Festival and China Alley? Well,
we hope to continue our partnership with the Carnegie Museum for the interim period until the temple is up and running, and we will return very loudly back into China Alley.
Arianna Wing, president of the China Alley Preservation Society. This Saturday, just a few blocks from China Alley, the Carnegie Museum will host a tribute to the Moon Festival. And that's today's show. Thank you for listening. If you've got feedback or a story idea, we would love to hear from you. Just email podcast@kvpr.org. Today's episode was produced by Jonathan Linden and KVPR with support from the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative. I'm Elizabeth Arkalian. Find the latest local news anytime at kvpr.org.